Welcome back to another episode of the Brawn Body Health and Fitness Podcast. Joining me today is Kyle Sammons. Kyle is currently serving a role as the coordinator of sports science and assistant strength and conditioning in the Arizona Cardinals organization. Kyle is a amazing individual and knows so much about so much, for lack of a better way to put it. Today, Kyle and I are going to dive into soft tissue injuries, including muscular strains, tendon injuries, and that sort of thing. And we're going to discuss how to approach them from a strength and conditioning standpoint. So in particular, you're going to hear a lot about isometrics and eccentrics in this episode today. Really great episode. I learned so much from working with Kyle, and I really appreciate his time. Be sure to check him out on Instagram at Kyle_Sammons_. This season is sponsored by ISOFIT, my go-to for all things isometric training. Be sure to check them out below as well. Enjoy. Kyle, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today, man. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, no, Dan, appreciate it, man. Thanks for having me, and I'm glad we finally lined it up.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. For people who might not be familiar with you, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and all the amazing things that you're doing in the strength and conditioning world?
Yeah, so let's see here. Let's take you on a journey. Played college football, so growing up, played sports, kind of like everybody in this field does. And so played football, basketball, track, baseball, multi-sport athlete, went to University of Nevada after junior college to play on a football scholarship, played wide receiver there for 3 years. And then the time came where you graduate and you're like, what do we do for money now? And you got to dive into the real world. So I actually went back home, and of all things, I wasn't in the field I'm in now. And so I went home, had some thinking to do, and I always loved, you know, human anatomy and performance. That's how I kind of operate as an athlete. I wasn't the most gifted, so I had to do things to kind of create an edge for myself, and that's where lifting weights, sprinting, eating certain ways always, in my mind, gave me an edge. So jumped into human performance. Went back to University of Nevada for no pay, worked there, and then just climbed my way up to become a full-time assistant there for 5 years. Helped with men's football. So I was one of their lead assistants for football, and then was in charge of men's basketball, women's soccer, women's track and field. So sprinting, middle distance. That was a really good learning experience for me because there were some injuries along the way that kind of opened my eyes. And that's also when I experienced injuries. I was done playing and I blew out both my patellar tendons,
Mm.
11 months apart from each other. I had never had an injury like that before. So it led me down this path where I'm kind of today. And so that led me into looking into why tendons or soft tissue just rupture. Had surgery on both. Asked the surgeon, who's a well-known surgeon in the area, why this happened. He had no idea. Looked at me and said, "These are usually happening in 45 to 50-year-olds, and you're 23, so I don't know." So that just led me to try and be curious, learn more. And then at University of Nevada, had some ACL injuries as well with women's soccer. Which once again led me to this path. And then I was fortunate enough to jump on board at University of Washington with Coach Peterson, Coach Saha, and that whole crew. I was there for 7 years. Um, Went to BCS bowl games, played in the playoffs against Alabama. Got to work with some really high end people, but also some high end athletes. And then there was a gap about a year where I got let go at University of Washington. I jumped on board at Strive, was their VP of performance there, which Strive is a surface EMG company that embeds sensors in compression shorts with an accelerometer in the belt buckle. And that actually helped me a lot about human just locomotion and just watching how people move, but also too trying to understand internal strategies versus external tasks. So that was really cool to see that come to fruition internally from a muscle standpoint, but also to accelerometry data. And then I was fortunate to jump on board here at Arizona Cardinals. I've been here since last April, and once again, I'm very fortunate and blessed to be a part of this organization with these high level people, practitioners, athletes, etc. So that's kind of the roadmap. Yeah, I've come across a lot of injuries. I've had to research, be curious, and learn.
Yeah, no, definitely. Kyle, that's an amazing journey. And I'm super excited and happy for you to be in the role you're at now. I mean, we were talking earlier about how much you love the Phoenix area. So it certainly seems like this is like where you're meant to be. And I think that's something that, for people listening too, a lot of people need to be reminded of is like, just because you're not where you want to be today, in the sense of like, you graduated college and you're like, okay, now what? All the way up to fast forward to where you are today. It's amazing how, a few years go by a lot quicker than you think, and you end up right where you wanted to be. So I think it's really important to kind of be patient and trust the process of things. And that's something that I'm sure you probably learned from your own patellar tendon rehab, but also being involved in the complex injury management of a variety of different athletes as well. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head in that tendon type injuries are on the rise. I've seen a couple individuals, you said you were 23. I would say 20s, 30s that have had similar, patellar tendon ruptures, quad tendon ruptures. I think the Achilles is probably the most common rupture that's getting a lot of attention lately. I forget the exact stats from a pro football and college football standpoint, but I know the injury rates are, notable and significant that way. And these tendon injuries are certainly going up. And as you mentioned, your surgeon kind of told you that they have no idea why. What's your thoughts or take as to why we're seeing so many more soft tissue tendon type injuries now?
I think that's a good question. Yeah, they're definitely on the rise. I think we've seen that. So over 20 years, we've seen Achilles ruptures in NFL go from 5 up to above 20. So that's 4x. To answer that question, I think the pendulum is swinging one way or the other still. In a sense, you are doing a lot of heavy loaded movements. You're building, the heavy slow stuff, the isometrics, heavy barbell work, and we're not really getting into the other area. Or you have this camp now that's solely doing sprinting, VBT, um, lower load, higher velocity movements, which is going to be different on the tendon and the muscle itself. And we're not really marrying these together, in my opinion. And so I think, as people want to say, it's like coming down the force velocity curve. When in reality, all we're doing is we're actually going the other way. We're having lower movement, or I should say heavier movement or no movement, and we're actually increasing the speed of the joints over time, or you're stacking them together. So these traits that we're chasing, we need to combine these so it's concurrent. That's my opinion, and I also think we really haven't known that much about tendons. Yeah, there's Michael Kerr over in Europe that's done really great work for 30 years on it, but I still don't know why people aren't looking up his work and some other people's work that are doing great work on this area until now, because they're having athletes blow apart. So there are a lot of variables, but I also think as humans, we just need to understand the tissue a little bit better and deeper. So understanding how the muscle and the tendon work together to pull on bone during low speed or high speed movements, and how motor learning takes that into effect. And I don't know. There's a lot to unpack here. So
There
kind of coming.
definitely is, and I love the road you're taking so far, Kyle. I mean, first off, from a training standpoint, like understanding what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what impact it's going to have. And I like how you kind of broke it down on like, your slower force things like your ISOs and
Mhm.
your higher force things like the VBT and that sort of thing. And I like your point too about a lot of people are not putting them together. A lot of strength coaches that I've seen in the past or worked with or talked with, and even your sports PTs, we're guilty of this as well. We kind of resort to this is what works for us. And we don't often stay in touch with our athletes 5 years later, 10 years later, 20 years later. So yeah, maybe it worked when we were working with that athlete at 16, 18 years old. But what happens 10 years from now when they're 28? And they're still doing the same kind of training model. So as we learn and understand more, our training approach needs to evolve, in my opinion. And I like your point too about, we really don't know what we think we know about soft tissue and tendons. We know a lot more than we did 20, 30 years ago, but there's still so much left to learn. Give an example, we mentioned like quad and patellar tendon versus Achilles tendon. The quad muscle in general responds really, really well to high volume. I can bulk up a quad. If someone's had ACL surgery, I can bulk it up in a couple of months. If you're looking at the calf after an Achilles rupture, it takes me a lot longer to get that thing strong again. Even if I crush it at high volume, even if I crush BFR and stim and all the same things I'm using, for a quad after ACL surgery, it doesn't quite have the same effect on the calf after, Achilles injury. And same thing, I've asked a few people, like, why do we think that is? And I haven't seen any great answers to that yet.
Yeah, I don't know what the answer would be to that, and I think that's a really good, I think, observation, but also too segue. And I think understanding proximal versus distal endpoints and
Mhm.
how we can train them differently, but also too when we're in athletic environments, when our foot hits the ground versus us propelling, very different. So decel versus accel, very different mechanisms. Yeah, we need to have both. Proximal needs to be bigger musculature. That's our quad, that's our hamstring, that's our glute. Whereas distal, that's definitely more tendinous. It's more collagenous fibers. So I think we need to train that differently. We need to look at the foot, ankle, shank a little bit differently than we train our quads. So I think that's what we had to do when we had those two Achilles ruptures. We had to learn fast, and I felt like I was drinking up a fire hose, man. Like, but at the end of the day, like we just got to be curious, and we can't just sit here and say, squatting, deadlifting is going to make everybody perform on Sundays or Saturdays at their highest level. We need to have a better approach, in my opinion.
I completely agree, and I like your point about how everything starts at the foot, right? Distal and distal attachment that way. So if movement starts from the foot, whether it's sprinting, speeding up, slowing down, changing direction, then obviously we need to hammer the foot and ankle training, strengthening, that sort of thing. And it's funny because in a lot of programs that tends to get missed in the private sector. It's like, oh yeah, just do 3 sets of calf raises at the end or something like that. So I think actually training those is important, but understanding how to train them. And you mentioned that it's a more tendinous type of area. I think anytime I hear tendon, my mind immediately goes to isos and eccentrics from a slow force standpoint. Do you tend to think similar things?
I think so. Just because of all the great work Keith Barr's been doing lately, and I think if you look up anybody else really that's in that space, Ebony Rio, Jill Cook, those people out of Australia, and then even Dustin Aranchek, who's done EQI research, like they're really going down that hole big time, and we need to understand what is the ramification when we program ISOs, EQIs. We need to understand what we're talking about too. And I think I hear ISOs now, and I'm like, man, well, ISOs, there's different versions. There's yielding and there's overcoming. And I think we need to peel those apart a little bit. And I think they're not synonymous because they have different outcomes, very different outcomes. And I think we can't lump those things together.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And kind of diving into that section for a second here, when I think about the yielding ISO, I think easy way to explain it is like leg extension machine, right? Like if I put weight on the leg extension machine and I kick forward and I hold it there, or I've also heard this called like a HEMA or a holding isometric muscular
Yeah.
activation. Essentially, over time, that is going to get progressively harder for me to hold that resistance as my muscle fatigues. So I would yield as a result. Whereas I see the overcoming, I've also seen this called a PIMA or a pushing or pulling ISO. Essentially, nothing's going to move. You're just going to push as hard as you can. And I think the intensity of that actually decreases over time because as the muscle fatigues, you're not putting out nearly as much force.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to put it. There's all kinds of semantics people go in, right? Like, and I think that's where we need to do a better job as practitioners. So we know, like, when we say this, that's what it means. And so we're not having all these different verbiages go around. But yeah, that's really good in a sense. Yielding is trying to force you into a position, you're resisting it. So there's load at your endpoints trying to push you in a position, you're resisting it with the muscles. Overcoming is you're pushing against something that's immovable. And yeah, that's the forces are very different. But yeah, you're right. Like you're gonna not be able to hold it as long probably. So those have different ramifications internally by a lot. So
What
I think we need to understand that.
what leads you to choose yielding over an overcoming ISO or vice versa?
Yeah, so I use both. But at the end of the day, yielding, in my opinion, is probably the more powerful one. And people are like, no, no, no. And the reason I'm saying that is because it mimics joints and soft tissue in sport. And there's some good research showing the activation patterns of the agonist, antagonist, synergistics in those two different isos. And the yielding gets all three, has really high activation of the synergistics and agonists, or sorry, antagonists, whereas the overcoming is really agonist driven. And so why it's important to know is if early in rehab or with an injury or in the off season, if we're doing a lot of overcoming, we're really not training the joint how we really should coming off a season and or going into an area that we need to create joint stability. So that's my 2 cents. In a sense, I always start with yielding because it's going to train the joint very differently, but also two, it's going to train the tendon very differently. In a
I
sense, you're going to get some stretching of the tendon over time, which you need. And I think coming off a season where people are jumping, cutting, sprinting, tendons get real stiff. And so actually adding a little bit more stretch to the tendon is not a bad thing. And I think we need to make sure we say that loud and clear is like people are in these camps where it's like, oh, you're going to make the tendon mush or you're going to make it like turn into steel. And no, we need both. And that's kind of what I'm sitting here saying is like we need both. And when do we put those into our program and understand like how they can be very beneficial in both ways?
Yeah, I completely agree. I love that point. And I mean, on that as well, going back to the whole analogy we gave on the yielding ISO, right? Like it almost becomes a super slow eccentric in a way. We call it an ISO, but if you hold long enough, eventually you're going to start to slip back. So definitely much more carryover, in my opinion, agreeing with you on the sports side of things and how things actually are going to work. I do still use the overcoming ones, and I really like them when people have pain. It's really easy to have someone like line up a certain position and just push or pull as hard as they can or whatever they can tolerate and build up over time there. It seems to have a fairly strong analgesic effect. So I think, in season, if people are coming to me banged up and I want to put some kind of load through the tendon, but I want them to feel better afterwards, I think the overcoming ISO has a very easy sell there, in my opinion. But I think that from a human performance standpoint and a actual carryover to the field, I like your point on the yielding ISOs. And I think the other piece that's important here is dosage, right? Like if you're doing a yielding ISO and you can hold it for 5 to 6 minutes, you probably haven't loaded it enough. Likewise, if you can only hold it for 3 seconds, you've probably loaded it way too much.
Yeah.
I think the most common durations I'm looking for people are 20-second, 30-second, and 45-second holds. And occasionally I go up to about a minute, but that's usually where I cap it.
I think what I've realized more and more is just stop it at 30 seconds. Will you go to 40 sometimes? Sure. If it's too light, yeah, set one, they might go to 40. And like, okay, we got to load it heavier and stop you at 30. And the reason is Keith Barr's whole crew's done a great job of explaining that, where, outside of 0 to 30 seconds, from 30 to a minute, it's really not making that much more change in the tendon. In a sense, the force starts to drop a lot, and then you go through that stress relaxation cycle. But I think at the end of the day, I'm personally, as a performance coach, after what you're talking about, so force, but also to making the tendon stiffer, allowing it to be stretched. And so what I mean by that is the stress strain cycle is if I start to add more load over time, it's going to take more load to make that tendon stretch. And that's what we want. But also too, what I've started to realize and I've started to listen more and more is some of these soft tissue injuries are at the actual myotendinous junction where the tendon and the muscle meet. And so there's another paper that is a review that came out recently looking at 2,700 hamstring strains, and 50% of them came of that area. And so we need to understand like ISOs are really great to make that area become stiffer, stronger through the mechanism of the muscle pulling on the tendon.
Yeah, no, I love that point. And, I think that's an essential element too. I'll throw it out there. A few months ago, I was doing weighted dips and I felt like a real painful like snap go across the front of my chest and ended up getting that MRI'd, and I had a 3 centimeter defect at the muscular tendinous junction on my right pec. And same thing there. It's like the tendon itself is fine, but the junction area is an
Yeah.
area of, weakness for me. And it still is an area that I'm slowly building back. So it's a matter of understanding, why we or what areas are injured first off and getting specific in that, and then how we can load them and modify our approach from a S&C and PT element. And I think the two, S&C and PT, need to go hand in hand together. I think that the more we work together as providers, the better our outcomes are going to be. Now, obviously, ISOs are great, but ISOs are probably not going to make up the majority of or the entirety of your training program. So as far as where we program them and then what other things we include in our programming.
No, I think ISOs are littered. They're littered everywhere. Like I think
Yep.
we can't do enough of them because kind of what I was saying earlier, we need to make sure the tendon and the MTJ are, working together efficiently so we
Mhm.
don't have a fail point. But also too, I think ISOs are a great way to teach. So if you want to teach posture position over time, yielding ISOs are no better. And I think that's going to motor learning because now you're restricting. So you're constraining joints and you're constraining movement to achieve a task that you want. And so they really don't have any variability to achieve that task. They have to do it a certain way. So the way I do it is early on is, yeah, the ISOs is their program, and then the ISOs that I do with them usually become their warm up, and so they're used to it. They know what they're doing. They have different joint actions, um, but then too, that's where you start stacking the eccentrics, the fast eccentrics, and dynamics depending on where they're at. But that's kind of the continuum to be within. And so whether they're coming off of an injury or they're healthy, like that program is still being played. It's just a matter of what traits are being stacked in or getting pulled out.
You bring up a interesting topic with the fast eccentrics. Is I've started to see a lot more of these over the past 3 to 6 months. Where do you see the fast eccentric coming into, the tendon loading, and how do you compare that with like the slow eccentric for tendon loading?
Great question. I think that's a really good question, and I think you are seeing that. Just go to Instagram and start looking around. You'll see it littered everywhere, and you're like, "Oh no!" Like that's great, but also too, we need to make sure what you just mentioned, the slow eccentric versus the fast eccentric. This kind of goes down the path of the why in the road. What adaptation are we looking for? Are we trying to get more tendon stiffness, or are we trying to get a little more, as they were, compliance, stretching of the tendon with the muscle in the slow movement of the eccentric. So I think it really goes into, okay, what is the task of the day or what do I want to try and do? And so I always are going to program the eccentrics first to make sure they can tolerate joint actions. They can actually resist getting smashed with weight. So like a trash compactor, you're resisting it, which creates a lot of torque, but also too, you're getting the stretch of the tendon with the muscle trying to pull on it as it lengthens. And then I go into the fast eccentrics, which you're going to have probably more tendon stretch, not as much muscle stretch. The muscle's kind of anchored down. The tendon stretching a little bit more. So you're getting into the series elastic components of the tendon. So that's the framework I kind of use: ISOs, eccentrics, which is a general term. There's layers in there. And then the fast eccentrics, you're getting into more attacking the tendon very viciously. That's,
Mhm.
as Keith mentions, that's jerk acceleration on the tendon, which that's very, very, very high acceleration. And that can cause more pain if you can't get them out of the pain. So
No, definitely. And the other element I like with the fast eccentrics, I haven't seen this incorporated as much online yet. Now that we say it, it'll be there in a week. But actually like changing the patterns of the fast eccentric. So like if I'm gonna do, say, a drop catch single leg RDL with a kettlebell, I don't want my athlete to just drop it and catch it with the same hand. I might have them go back and forth between hands, or I might have them, right before the rep, give them a cue of when to go and which hand to catch it with. Maybe it's the same one, or maybe it's the opposite one. To your point before about, motor learning and the neural side of sport, for lack of a better way to put it, I think a lot of these injuries that we see on, TV or that sort of thing are coming from a reaction to a stimulus. And maybe the body was ready to react and maybe it wasn't. So I kind of asked myself, how can we bring the reactive element into the strength and conditioning, the PT side of things? Because if I can, there's the whole concept of sports specificity and GPP and where we draw the lines there. But in general, I think that there is something to be said about, if especially if you have someone who is injured, trying to look at how the injury occurred and specifically train the things that led up to them getting hurt in the first place so that it hopefully doesn't happen again.
That's a great way to say it, and I think that kinda goes back to this whole, framework that I devised with a friend of mine when I was at University of Washington, and this is what we looked at, is like, we can't stay on one side and be in a camp, as we call it. So that's like the high force camp. Well, that means heavy slows. That's actually lower force, in my opinion. It's more internal forces than external. And then ground reaction forces are your fast eccentrics and plyos. And so the way we looked at it was, let's just look at ground reaction forces as load on the bar drops and as limb speed pick up. Well, there's been research done on the ratio of eccentric and centric ratios. As limb speed picks up closer to sprinting, the eccentric demand goes through the freaking roof. And so why I'm saying that is because that's when the injuries start to take place, but also too, it's no more conscious movement. Heavy slow is conscious movement. Fast eccentric plyometrics is not. It's more reflexive, as if you want to call it that way, where you have to respond, react. And why we came up with that is because we started looking at ACL ruptures and like actual video analysis. They happen so freaking fast. I mean, you're looking at 40 milliseconds. So that's 2 times faster than, max velocity ground contact time.
Yeah.
I think we
I
need to
mean,
keep that in the back of our mind, right? When we program, like, we can't keep giving cues because that's still conscious movement. So if, like, you watch me work with an athlete, like, there's points in time I don't say a word. I just tell them what to do, and they do it, and I'm like, "No, faster. No, faster. No, faster." Like, that's my cue, and then I'll fix on, like, postural stuff, but at the end of the day, like, I think we need to understand conscious movement and subconscious or reflexive reacting and what it does internally.
yeah, no, I completely agree with that, Kyle. I think that's a great point is understanding what we can control and what we can't control. And on that point too, the importance of cueing or lack thereof, being intentional with the things that we say and do instead of just kind of dishing out cue after cue after cue. Like if you're giving 12 to 15 cues when you're working with an athlete, they're not going to remember half of them, and you're probably wasting a session at that point. I think that there's a lot of value in adding 1 to 2 good cues, depending on what your goals are, right? Like, obviously, if I'm working with a powerlifting athlete and I can give them a cue that's going to help their deadlift and then they deadlift 10 pounds more, great, home run. But
Absolutely.
for the majority of field athletes, they don't think about those cues when they're on the field. They're thinking about all the other things that are going on. So I don't really want them to become reliant on needing external cueing in order to move. And to a certain extent, like movement can be changed, but there's certain things I need to be willing, or whatever the correct term is, I need to be willing to admit and accept that there's certain things we can't change. If I get a guy who's 60 years old and he's come to me running the same way for the past 50 years, I'm probably not going to magically change the way he's run his entire life in a 1 hour session once a week. It's just not going to happen. And I need to be, open to accepting what I can control and what I can't control.
You hear it all the time, like they're elite or they've done something for 50 years, so let's not change them. And that's where, like, if you hear me with my coaching cues, it's going to be more on the isos and eccentrics that are very slow because that's conscious movement. They can think about things, they can feel certain muscles working. That's what you want. So when they go to the faster things, the motor learning takes over. So the motor patterns turn into motor learning based on what they feel, what you're telling them, postural things. And so over time, that then picks up. The time component goes down, their reaction goes up. And if you've added variability to their actual like internal workings, they're going to hopefully achieve a better task with a better internal way. So internal strategies are going to be displayed externally very differently.
Yeah.
Whether their speed goes up, whether that's their max velocity goes up, whether that's their max acceleration or deceleration changes, like however you want to quantify that. But at the end of the day, like I think you're spot on. Like when they start doing things in their sport, giving cues, I don't know, man. Like that's kind of like throwing salt into a fan and hoping it's going to stick, and you're like, well, that didn't work.
No,
um,
you're right
it's
about that. And it's come to be a realization of mine that a lot of high level athletes they really compensate well with movement. And sometimes fixing it, quote unquote, fixing it doesn't actually solve anything. When I was in college, my capstone for my doctorate degree, we looked at, I think, 150 or so college athletes, and we looked at ankle dorsiflexion restriction. And there's all kinds of stuff about dorsiflexion range of motion out there, in relation to the ACL, in relation to ankle sprains, and so on that way. So assessed ankle closed chain dorsiflexion range of motion, did an intervention that improved range of motion, and we documented the improvement, and then did a test retest on Y balance. So, a dynamic balance, which that's probably the biggest oxymoron I've said today, but a balance metric that we look at a lot in sports and athletes. And we
Yeah.
saw no improvement. So their range of motion improved, but their
Sure.
function did not improve at all. So just because we can do things that make a meaningful objective, improvement doesn't actually mean that that's going to carry over to something that, is going to matter to them or actually have an impact on the sport, right? Like we have to be willing to accept what we can control and what we can't fix.
Yeah, I think that's a great, story and case study right there because I think we as performance coaches and even, maybe even the PT world, like we have biases. So in our opinion, if we change the range of motion, they're going to achieve the task better, right? Because they can get more dorsiflexion. You just said that wasn't the case. So I think that's interesting because there's been points in time in my career where I've worked with certain athletes and we used to do, half kneeling dorsiflexion tests as part of our screening. And I kind of like was sitting there and some dudes had really mobile ankles, some guys didn't. And it was interesting to see the guys that actually had stiffer ankles were our better or stiffer athletes that could run differently. They could decel differently. They could express their athletic acumen differently. So it's really interesting because I think it's not as simplistic as we wanted to make it, and it's the reductionistic approach. I think is almost too simple, and we have to actually probably ask questions: Is this really true? So I think stuff like that, right? Like, I've done the same thing. I thought I was training people a great way. Had 4 ACLs in one season with soccer. And I was like, whoa, like, okay, let's change this model here a little bit. So I think like we just have to evolve and we got to keep learning and we got to keep asking questions. And, the very smart people that have mentored me is make sure you start with a good question
Mhm.
to be answered. We can answer anything we want, but is it really truly being explained through what we're experiencing? I don't know.
Yeah, no, for sure. And you bring up some great points there. First off, I want to hit the point that you mentioned on, the ACLs in season there. It's never a one person thing. So if you're the strength coach or if you're a PT and, two or three of your patients go out and re-tear, like if you've done your due diligence and you've done the best you could at the time, then it is not your fault at all. And I think that's something that a lot of people in today's day and age, especially online, are getting a little bit misguided with is, people see an injury and they're very quick to point the finger or they're very quick to say, well, I could have fixed that or I could have prevented that. When in reality, you don't even you don't even know and begin to understand the situation that athlete's in. You see it on the day to day, just like I see it. Like athletes are people too. And I think a lot of times we forget that. So sometimes people don't sleep well, or, people have things going on at home, or, they've got kids, they've got a dog, they've got, bills to pay, they've got all these other life stresses that people don't even think about. And all of those things can play into what we see on the field. So I think there's a lot of people that are quick to point the finger when someone gets hurt, when in actuality, I don't think it's any one person thing. I think it's too multifactorial. And going off of that, and the second piece I think you were kind of alluding to there is, at the end of the day, like we have to coach movement. And
Yeah.
we've talked about this in the past. Like, the barbell squat is a great exercise. I love the back squat. I suck at it, but I love it. But that doesn't mean that that's the only way to train the squat pattern. There's hundreds of other variations. So just because I like a certain exercise doesn't mean that's the best thing for every single person I work with day in and day out. I have to be open and willing to kind of shift from what I like to what that person in front of me might need at that given moment.
Yeah, that's true coaching, in my opinion. So we're coaches of movement, not of exercises. And so like I think sometimes we get that flipped. And so I don't know, people hear me all the time say, let's understand principles to apply methods. And I think that still resonates really well in a sense. Why are we using a barbell back squat? And do we know the ramifications of it? And or why are we using a split squat? And do we know the ramifications of it? And I think sometimes we just don't do that and ask those questions. We just kind of hit autopilot and program. Um, and so I think that is a really challenging piece, but I think that's what makes a practitioner a practitioner. I mean,
Yeah,
that's where the online stuff kind of agitates me a little bit. But no, I think you're right. Kind of going back a little bit. I think in today's world, like there's a lot of opportunistic people out there, and they all think they're gurus. But I think there's so many variables with injury. We can't sit here and say one thing is going to solve everything. I do think we need to keep learning and understanding why these happen and why they take place. And that's, led me and my friends dive in these rabbit holes about tendons. And it sounds weird and nerdy, but I love learning about tendons because I honestly feel like that's the missing link in performance is we don't understand tendons, the muscle, and the extracellular matrix very well. We understand cross-sectional area very well, understand exercises very well. But I think at the end of the day, like we need to understand force transfer and we need to understand force blocking as Dan Cleather talks about. So when my foot hits the ground, like can I actually block the forces redirecting? And if not, you're usually going to get hurt. So yeah, there's a lot of things to unpack here, but I think at the end of the day, like this online stuff is very interesting to see where it's going. And I don't know how to say this other than I would love to have these people. Okay, let's see your results and let's see your roadmap you're going to give to prevent this from happening. Or
yeah.
better yet, if this does happen, how fast can you get this guy back? And at what rate are they now operating at?
Yeah, no, for sure. The outcomes. There's an old saying, actions speak louder than words.
Yeah.
To the point that you made on tendons, I think there's what, 4,000 in the body or something absurd like that. Like we have more tendons than muscles. So it certainly seems like, I remember in school we learned all the muscle origin, insertion, action, nerve innervation, blood supply for certain muscles, but we didn't really go into tendons much at all. So I certainly echo your point on that possibly being a missing link in the sports performance and human performance world. And ultimately, I think it comes back to, as you mentioned, tendons speak in units of force. And if injuries happen because of too much force in a certain area, then maybe I have a fault somewhere in my system that led to that, and I need to improve my system's ability to transmit force throughout its entirety.
100%. Spot on. Couldn't agree more. Um, and that's where I use the word framework. And for me, system, it just means too rigid for me in
Yep.
a sense. Like you have to go through almost like block training where it's like block one, block two, block three before you can progress. And I think what we kind of fell into at University of Washington and why we built this framework for those Achilles guys and it's still being run is because when you train athletes or you work with a person, they're going to do something with you where in your mind, let's call it a high force movement, which is a heavy slow, high internal forces. But then you go see them playing basketball 30 minutes later. Do those forces match each other? And does the tendon responsibility matching each other? No, not really. And so that's what hit me square in the face. And I'm like, whoa, man, like we need to make sure these athletes have all the tools to operate. End of story. What that means is transmitting force, blocking force, high internal forces, pulling on bones. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm too easy to think it that way, but it's just as easy for me to think about it that way. And force transmission is huge. It's massive.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And as we mentioned, that applies to tendon injuries, but also other injuries such as, the ACL and that sort of thing.
Yep.
So I'll hit you with like a random one here. Say you are Kyle, who knows everything that you know right now, and you get put in charge of, hey, I've got to train like a high school football guy now, or like a high school soccer person, or something like that. Like, how do you go about taking everything that you've learned and come to know about tendons and injuries and everything that's gotten you to this point, and then apply it to what would be the next generation?
Yeah, I think I'm still going to use the same framework.
Yep.
And the reason I'm saying that is because younger kids, they definitely have more tendon compliance. That's why they're so mobile. And so adding more stiffness to them is not going to hurt them. It's
Mhm.
not going to make them turn into like an iron deer. All it's going to do is allow them to transfer forces very differently from the bone to the muscle and the nervous system from the muscle to the bone. So what I would do is, depending on what sport they're playing, it's probably gonna start the same way, and that's gonna start with yielding isos and incorporating slow eccentrics. So that's, EQIs very slowly, not heavy load. And the reason I'm saying that is because it's gonna teach them posture and position over time. And what I've seen with young athletes is they're like Bambi. They're kind of falling all over the place. And so, am I saying this is the gold standard? No, that's how I approach it. And then I'd mix in fast eccentric. So that's, jumping off boxes and working on decel. That is getting pulled into movements and decelerating 2 feet. That's getting pulled in laterally and decelerating with 1 foot. That's doing different things of that nature. And then they're going to get plyometrics as well, whether it's through their sport or through me. But at the end of the day, I just need to make sure that they're resilient enough. What I mean by resilient, that's being able to tolerate the forces they're going to go through in their sport. And I think that's another thing we could probably talk about too is just practitioners, I think, assume we know the forces that they're going to go through in their sport. And that's where the injuries start to take place, is because the mismatch happens. What the forces the joints or limbs go through on the field or court are very different than what they're experiencing in their training settings. And so there's a cliff here and here. If this is essentially the sport, this is where we're trained at, there's a giant gap that we're missing. And we need to fill that gap.
I agree. And at least in my limited experience thus far, I found that you can't fill that gap by picking up a book and reading about it. Like
No.
I've yet to like pick up like one specific book that is like, flip the switch for me on how to rehab a football player or a basketball player or something like that. I've actually found the most benefit from trying to get involved in the sport myself to a certain extent. And, maybe I grew up playing the sport, like I grew up playing football, baseball. So I kind of have a little bit of a background for some of them. But for others, like, I'm rehabbing a gymnast right now. I've never done gymnastics. I think I had a year career as a gymnast when I was like 8 or something like that. So, like, for me to understand what's going to go into it, I need to immerse myself into the world a little bit and actually play around with some of the things. Like, I need to try a handstand. I need to try a muscle up. I need to try a front lever, and I need to like just see, what I'm feeling myself and then relate that to what my athlete might feel, right? Like I think there's something to be said about getting down in the trenches and actually taking action to learn. And again, maybe I'm missing the magic book that has all the answers. But I just haven't found that yet from specific carryover from training into sport.
No, I'm with you 100%. Like, I think getting in the trenches and feeling certain things is the best way to do it. And I think too, it builds trust with the athletes. If they see you trying things, or you're asking questions and you're genuinely curious, I think that's going to build a lot more trust as opposed to being like, no, do this because I'm the expert. Um, I don't think that works very well. So um, I'm the same way. Like, I get curious, I start trying things. What does this feel like? Where am I feeling it? Why am I feeling this? And then too, like, that's where technology, I think, has gotten kind of like crazy, is we need to use technology to probably answer questions as opposed to slapping technology on people and thinking it's going to give us the answer. Um, and so that's kind of how I operate too, is like, I'll sit there and think, oh, cool. Like, well, what are the forces when I do exercise X differently? And I'll use force plates. Or when I was at Strive, looking at muscle patterns, in a sense, the firing rates with muscle amplitude and frequency, doing certain things. Does this match when I do a squat versus run? Does that match? And then two, just learning human movement. I think we say we know everything, but I don't think we really do. We just got to keep learning, man. Like, That's where I think working in different sports is really beneficial because it's going to stretch your mind as a practitioner.
Yeah,
Um,
I completely agree, and I'll take a step further too. Is like everyone you work with, whether that's yourself, your patients, clients, athletes, whatever you want to call them, everyone kind of becomes their own case study, right? N
yeah,
equals one. So, and if you have access to all those technological type things, the force plates, the dynamometers, I would love to have a Proteus in my clinic. I don't
sure.
have one yet, but if you have access to all of those things, then you can essentially get all the data, look at how that person is presenting, and then you could compare that to other people that you've worked with, the normative values online, whatever that way. But I think you kind of mentioned this a bit is it's not enough to just look at the data and base things off the data. You actually have to match that to the person in front of you and have conversations with them about things. Because, if you do all these tests and you pick up hey, this guy's right arm is a lot stronger than his left arm, but he's a quarterback who throws right-handed, then maybe we don't have to do anything. And maybe the opposite is true. Maybe throwing arm is significantly weaker than the non-throwing arm, or there's different forces that the non-throwing arm exhibits and displays better than the throwing arm, then, maybe that is a time to intervene. But ultimately, you're not going to know until you put it into the context of the person in front of you.
N of one, as Matt Jordan says, right? And I think we have to really do that even in team settings, is we have to treat everybody as N of one. And I think that's going to build trust very rapidly, but also too, it's going to help you as a practitioner try and answer the question, as opposed to just using a blanket statement like, "Oh, no, just do this," protocol. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. But I think at the end of the day, be curious. Yeah, like what are the forces these limbs are experiencing? Can we get close to that? And that's kind of the framework we put together. That's why we did that, is because we need to match in the weight room or on field closer to their sport. And if not, the athlete's going to fall apart or they're not going to be able to perform at their level that the coaches want. At the end of the day, it's up to the coaches to decide like what they want done. We have to support that.
And, the other thing that keeps coming in the back of my mind here is, when whatever practitioner field, whatever you're involved in, like it's really difficult to sit there and have an athlete that you worked with get injured. Like it's very difficult. And at least for myself, I tend to internalize that a lot about like, what could I have done differently? What should I have done differently? And as we mentioned before, sometimes you need to change and sometimes you don't. Have you found any sort of like self-litmus test that you use to kind of determine whether or not you need to change something in your system, or is that still an ongoing thing?
No,
I,
I think that
I
hits
use the
home.
term system again too. I'm sorry.
Whatever you say system again, I'm just going to hop off. I'm kidding. No, I think that hits home for me, especially because I go through that all the time. In a sense, like I read a bunch, I apply it as best I can. But at the end of the day, how do we get judged or how do we know if we're doing the right thing for our athlete and the athlete centric model? And for me, I take it as, can these guys go and express these things that they want to do and at what rate and at what magnitude? And for me, we use technology to do that. But at the end of the day, that's how I use it as litmus test. Don't get twisted. Like I come home and I'm sitting talking to my wife, like, man, like I'm stressed because X, Y, and Z. But at the end of the day, it's because we care and we care about the athlete and we want them to do better and we want them to succeed so they can go and play their sport again at a high level without feeling like I have to put the governor back on because I'm going to get hurt. We need to rip that governor off. And what I mean by that is we got to train our athletes a certain way that they can go and do, whatever they need to do to accomplish their task without falling apart again. And that's my litmus test. It's time. So there are, time frames at play here. So can I meet the time frame or speed it up, not maliciously or in a negative way? But I use it as a manner. How are these athletes progressing from what I'm seeing from velocity, acceleration, ground contact time, force expression, force attenuation? I know people don't like that term. Um, that's my litmus test is when they get back lumped out there, are they able to hit their max V again? That's all we care about. But I think is it a re-injury If it's a re-injury, we didn't do our job. And I take it personal. And I know, like we talked about that earlier, like we can't really take everything personal, but I do because I challenge myself. I hold myself to a certain standard. I don't want re-injuries
Hmm. Yeah, no, I'm
because
the same.
there's like a missing link in my framework that I'm using, and I need to figure it out. Because if I keep using the same framework, I'm going to keep having re-injuries probably. I don't like that.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think that's something I kind of relate to as well is like, you know, at some point, someone you work with is going to re-injure. It's ugly, it's sad, but it's the truth. Like, no one is 100% perfect when it comes to re-injury rate. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't stop trying to achieve 100%. We should try and figure out what that 100% mark looks like and continue to push further and further towards that goal of no re-injuries, period. And, as we do that, we're going to continue to learn and evolve and grow so much along the way. And it certainly sounds like that's what you've been doing for your entire career, Kyle, is you just continue to learn and grow. And the more you learn, the more effective and efficient you become at what you do.
Yeah, that's how I'm wired. That's my thread. And I think too, like working under Chris Peterson at Washington, like was a very wide eye experience for me because he's a one percenter. Like I can't speak highly enough about that individual. Like he's the best. Um, I can still call him. He answers. Like I'm fortunate to have that relationship, but I think he taught us a lot about how to conduct business outside of X's and O's, hypothetically, or barbells and kettlebells. Like have a plan A and a plan B. Don't be defined by what you do. And I think too, like what you just mentioned, have a high standard and shoot for that standard. Don't waver from it. Because once we start wavering from it, we're accepting, mediocrity. So I'm with you. I've also had to do it because I have an unconventional background. I'm not trained in a lot of this stuff, so I've had to create an edge for myself. Well, how have I done that? Read research, worked with injured athletes, failed, failed again, but I kept getting up and just kept reading and kept reading and kept reading. And I think I'm on the better path now of understanding like why things happen. I'm not an expert. I'm not a guru. Because if I call myself that, I've stopped learning. So it's funny because Buddy and I talk all the time about this. Like we just got to keep learning for the betterment of human and for athletes. So
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And I think that's a great point that really hits home for a lot of people, Kyle. And I feel like we covered a lot of ground today as it relates to tendons and injuries and just overall evolution of PT and S&C in general. Is there anything that we missed or anything we didn't touch on that you want to?
no, I think one thing that's been stuck in the back of my brain during this whole conversation, but it's still stuck back there since I've read the research article is I think a lot of the times as practitioners, and I know you could probably resonate with this in your space, Dan, is I think we say too much that, tendons and muscle have different protein synthesis rates and that they recover very differently. And I think there's some good research coming out now about that. And actually, certain tendons and ligaments actually have the same, if not greater, protein synthesis rates as tissue, muscle tissue, I'm talking about. So I think we can't put ourselves into boxes and say, like, oh, no, these guys can't or gals can't come back before this time frame. What if neurologically and tissue wise they're more developed because of what you're doing and they can do these tasks at a higher rate now? Are we going to slow them down? I don't know. I think these are good questions to ask, but I think that's where a lot of people are doing great research on this right now. um, Protein synthesis rates of different areas of the body, so we don't sit there and have these strong guardrails where we can't get outside of them.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point and a interesting takeaway too is plain and simple, there's things we can do to modify protein synthesis rates. I mean, a lot of different things, and some of them are kind of banned, so we're not going to do them, but
No.
others are very, very legal and ethical, and we can do a lot of them in our rehabs, and it then becomes a question of why aren't we? So I think that's an interesting point, and that's going to certainly lead to a big discussion on the timeline versus criterion based progressions moving forward. And I think that's something you look at the Achilles, you look at the ACL, and a lot of people still go by the timeline and there's good research for it. But, at the end of the day, as our rehab knowledge advances, as our surgical knowledge advances, and we start doing, better, stronger work from a surgical standpoint, like as everything advances, the rehab approach and overall discharge, return to sport also needs to advance along with them.
Yeah, no, I think it does, and I'm not saying that the timeline's a bad way to go. I think have that in the back of your mind, but I think too increasing protein synthesis rates a certain way, and that's through certain loading mechanisms. That's through the isos eccentrics. That's consuming certain products. Like there's ways to help. I think along the way this continuum to in the back of our mind speed up the clock a little bit. We're not trying to do it maliciously, like I talked about, but it's just as medicine and as practitioners are progressing, I think it's something that we have to challenge a little bit, and it's okay to challenge conventional wisdom.
I completely agree. I mean, that's how we've gotten to where we are now today. I mean, if we were still just, following conventional wisdom, we'd probably be what, decades in the past. So
Throwing casts on people and tell them not to move. So
that'll get them better. Kyle, for people who want to find out more about you or check you out online, where can they find you at, man?
Instagram is probably the best right now. It's just Kyle_Sammons_. Feel free to reach out, questions, comments, please do. I'm an open book. I do have a Twitter as well. But if you just go to my Instagram, I think my Twitter handle's on there as well. And that's the place to start probably. So we'll leave it at that. Pretty simple.
Yeah, no, for sure. We'll link to all that in the description below there. Kyle, I really appreciate your time and everything you shared with us today, man. Thank you so much.
No, I appreciate it, Dan. Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure. And